Hey guys, we finally got part to put the axle shaft back together. So we're gonna put it in. Got all of our parts laid out here. And we're gonna put everything back in the hole. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're going to put the axle shaft into the axle. You want to make sure that there's either scrape all the dirt out of the axle tube, or you very carefully guide the inside of the axle so it doesn't drag a bunch of dirt in your seal. And it fits in just like that. Next, you want to install your spindle and brake shield. You want to make sure you grease the inside of your spindle bushing as well as the seal. For spindle grease, I'm going to be using the same thing I used in the CV axle shaft. It's a Molly fortified grease. I'm just filling the cavity between the seal and the bushing. And I'll take some and rub it along the seal and put it down into the bushing. You can also take some grease and put it on your axle shaft. Before you put the spindle on, it's recommended to put some kind of anti-seize lubricant so that the parts don't seize together the next time you got to take them apart. Because this is somewhat of a test vehicle and it's going to be on and off all the time, as I check the wear of different upgrades that I do to this, we're going to just use grease. This Molly grease is pretty nasty stuff, but it's not nearly as nasty as anti-seize. So I'll just lubricate the flange of the knuckle with a little bit of this Molly grease. This particular grease does stay put really well. If it was a lower end grease, whether it was Molly or just regular wheel bearing grease, I'd have concerns that this wouldn't, this would kind of just fall out over time. But this particular grease that I'm using does really stay put, so it should work nice for me. Take your spindle, slide it over the axle shaft. The groove for the spindle nut lock washers won't exactly go up on these, but put it up as close as you can get it. You can put it down, I guess, if you wanted, but I find it's easier to see, if you were doing this on the ground or something on jack stands, you don't have to bend way over to see where your groove is. After that's on, put your brake shield on. You could also anti-seize the back of this, but it's probably not necessary. Okay, I've got it held in place with 2 bolts. I'm going to put Loctite on the rest of the bolts. This way I'm not trying to fight lining everything up when I got Loctite dripping off the bolts everywhere. Just makes it a little easier. And it doesn't take a whole lot. That one's in. Now I'll Loctite this. Another way to do this, you could, I guess, just squirt a little bit in all the holes, and then you wouldn't have to worry about keeping it lined up when you put your first bolt in. You could put these on with a rattle gun, tighten them up by hand when they're snug, but we're just going to go by hand. Going in a crisscross applesauce pattern. Torque specs for everything will be delivered in a later video when we go over the complete axle. If you've got enough automotive experience, you can kind of feel about what it should be. And for this video, that's what we're gonna do. Just kind of go by feel. These bolts are not very big in diameter. It would really surprise me if they were much more than 40 or 45 foot-pounds or so. I've got the book for this, but it, of course, was not written in the United States, so it's a little bit harder to follow with the translations and stuff. And not every torque spec is listed. But I've done enough of this stuff to know about what it should be. Just kind of go around one more time. Make sure they're good. Now we'll put the hub assembly on. Bit. We'll take a little bit of wheel bearing grease and squirt it in kind of right behind the seal here. Take some of the excess grease, coat the seal really well. Slide the hub assembly on. Just like that. Now before I put the inner bearing in, or the outer bearing, I'm going to fill the cavity with grease. It's usually not necessary to do that. I do it because if water does get in here, I don't want a whole lot of void space for large amounts of water to stay in there. Half a tube later, she's full. Now we'll put the outer bearing in. Slides on just like that. Also taking a little bit of this extra grease here and just smearing it around on the inside so if water gets in, it doesn't sit on any bare metal. Put a little more in. Now it's time for spindle nuts. This particular application uses a thrust washer that goes up against the bearing first. Then an inner nut. I would like to point out also, I believe I said it in my last video when I took all this stuff apart and then repacked the bearings and reinstalled them. I am not using the spacer and shims between the two bearings. It's a lot more complicated setup than just kind of doing it the old-fashioned way to get your end play. With the shim and spacers, you'll tighten your inner nut down, you'll check your end play, and if it's I don't remember what the specs are, 10 thousandths-ish of backlash. If it's not within that, you got to add shims or remove shims. You got to take the whole hub out basically, because you can't really reach in there to remove that stuff, and it's just a lot more steps than what I want to have to do. So I'm going to set it up the old-fashioned way. This is not exactly by the book. Like I said, that'll be released in a video down the road when we go through a whole axle. But to do it this way, essentially what you do is tighten the inner nut up while rotating the hub, get the bearings seated, back it off a little bit, tighten again, do this a few times. I'm confident the bearings are now seated where they need to be. The last step is to get your end play. And I like to go roughly 1/3 of a turn on this particular axle. So there's 1/4, and that's pretty close to 1/3. Now, right off, that will be a bit excessive, but there's a little bit of slop in these threads. Not really slop, I guess, just a little gap in the threads, and when you tighten your inner nut, it will push when you tighten your outer nut, it will push the inner nut up against the other side of the threads, and it'll take up a little bit of the slack there. So the next thing that goes on is your lock washer. Some of these have tabs, bend over tabs that bend over the flats of the nut. Some do not. This particular setup I have does. And as you can see, probably it has been used. You can get a couple uses out of these usually before you have to replace them. You just don't want to reuse the same tabs because they're prone to breaking. So as long as you've got more tabs you can get a fresh bend on, be just fine. And actually it looks like I have to straighten one of these up just a hair. Just gotta straighten one up so I can get my socket back on it. I didn't have them all the way flattened back out when I took it out, so I knew which ones I had already used. Looks like I gotta flatten out a little bit more. And then the outer nut just gets tight. There we go. Check our end play. Not quite as much as there was before I tightened the outer nut. Still just enough, I think. I don't know if you can hear it on the camera. I can barely feel it. The backlash or the end plate should be, you hear it, but you don't really feel a whole lot of it. If you can really feel it, you got too much. So that's good. Just for safety's sake, we'll make sure. Got it tight. and we're good. Now we'll bolt the caliper back up with the caliper bolts. Okay. Calipers in place. We're going to do the same thing. I got one bolt to hold it, so I'm not smearing Loctite everywhere. And I'm going to put just a drop or two of Loctite on the other bolt. That bolt's in. Remove the top bolt. Add a smidge of Loctite, which is probably redundant because these do have lock washers, but that's okay. If you're in a real corrosive area, a lot of the places that I used Loctite, you'd probably be better off with anti-seize. When you're doing this, you just want to keep an eye, make sure you don't booger up your brake hose. Make sure they're relatively tight. I'm just going off experience right now, but I'm guessing it's around maybe 50 or 60 foot-pounds for those ish. Exact details will be in another video. Get rid of the hanger bracket. Now that I've got my spindle nuts installed, I'm going to go ahead and bend over a couple of tabs. Okay. Now that's done, we're going to install our locking hubs. Worn locking hubs have a longer pilot and an O-ring. You want to make sure that O-ring is in good shape. Mile marker hubs don't have quite as deep of a pilot on the inside of them, and they seal with a gasket. However, I made an O-ring just to see if it works any better. The gasket didn't have very good coverage in a couple areas. I tried an O-ring. It seemed to work, so far. There was a little bit of moisture in there, but it wasn't too much, and it could have been coming in around a bolt hole or who knows where. And I did inspect this locking hub, so I had it all clean and everything. I have not yet greased it, so I'm gonna put a little bit of grease in there. Moly grease would work good for these. Some of the locking hubs have a support bearing instead of a support bushing. This one has a bushing, so moly grease will be fine, but I'm just gonna puke a little bit of just wheel bearing grease in there. And it doesn't take a whole lot. If you overpack your locking hubs, they will eventually cease to function when the grease gets all dried up and all that. So I got some in there, just gonna work it back and forth a little. It should be good. Also want to take a little bit, coat the splines. Doesn't take much. install my custom sized O-ring. I don't make an O-ring quite the right size, so I had to get just the bulk cord, rubber cord, cut it to the right length and glue it together. It works. Now that my O-ring's installed, I've got my bolts ready to go. What I'm using for a lock washer is the Belleville washers they used in old Spicer external hubs. A different kind of lock washer, like a Nord lock washer or something, would probably work a little bit better, but because this vehicle is taken apart pretty frequently to check things, you know, these work just fine, and they don't tear up the flange like a regular split lock washer would, or a Nord lock. If you don't plan on being in there, you know, if you're not in mud and water all the time, you know, Nord lock washer is probably the way to go. Kind of set it and forget it. Every once in a while I do check these, and sometimes I'll get a loose bolt. And especially reusing these are kind of a one-time use thing, but I'm just kind of going with it to see how much life I can get out of them before they just don't hold anything anymore. I have broken bolts in the rear in the past, and a little trick that I just kind of come up with was put grease in the bolt holes. The broken bolt, I'm using super grade 8 bolts. You can't drill them, but I was able, because the hole was greased, I was able to kind of put a pick in there and just turn the bolt out just like that. So I'm going to keep putting grease in the bolt holes. That's totally up to you. I can't officially recommend it on a fastener like that, but if you're in a high corrosion area, or you know, you're afraid you might break a bolt and you don't want the hassle of trying to drill it out, not being able to drill it out depending on the grade of bolt you use, yeah, throw some grease in the holes. Just, you know, check them every once in a while, make sure they're still tight. But right now I'll put some grease in. Couple shots, that's all it takes. You don't want to put too much in, because it'll kind of hydrolock on you, trying to put the bolts in. As long as you don't get too much, it will squeeze out past the threads. And again, on this I'm just using wheel bearing grease. I've used moly grease in the past, but I just happen to have my needles are set up in wheel bearing grease right now. So you go ahead, slide your locking hub on. Push your axle shaft all the way through. Put your axle shaft retainer snap ring on. Just like that. Right now would be the time to grease your CV shafts if you have the upgraded shafts, and if you haven't greased them yet already like I have. You know, the Zerk's right in the end here. Otherwise, ready to put the outer, well, before we put the outer cap on, we'll put the bolts in. With the design of the outer cap, it does kind of, you do need kind of a swivel socket to get in there. But if you don't put the outer cap on just yet, then you don't need that. So you can see I have clearanced these so I can actually get a socket on there. I didn't do it perfect though, so I still got to watch to make sure my socket doesn't get wedged. It's easiest to tighten these up on the ground, but you can take a pry bar or something just to hold it from moving. Just make sure you're not boogering up threads on your studs or pressing too hard on the hub body. And I'll get these kind of close. Actually, we'll get rid of this extension now. And I'll get them to where I think they're pretty good, and I'll still check them once I get this thing on the ground. Let's see. They're not as tight as they're gonna have to be, but they're tight enough to work. So I've got the snap ring on, my CV shaft is greased. Now it's time to put on the outer cap. And this is easiest if you can put two of these little screws in to kind of hold the gasket in place. Make sure it gets lined up right. There's a little pin in these mile markers you want to make sure it isn't binding on anything when you put it on. And I'll do the same with this. I'll just kind of get everything snug-ish and then do my crisscross applesauce. It is recommended to replace the gaskets that go out here every time you service it. However, I'm just pushing limits, so I'm going to reuse it until it looks like it's not going to work for me anymore. All right, those are all snug. These don't get very tight. That's all done. Now we just got to put the wheel on. These 35-inch tires are quite heavy, especially with my internal bead locks. With my internal bead locks, it adds, I don't know, it makes this whole assembly a good 100 and something pounds anyway. Remember, lift safely. If it's easier to lower the vehicle real close to the ground to do this, by all means, do that. If I had to do more than just the one tire, I would have absolutely done that. Go ahead and put the lug nuts on. I'm going to use a rattle gun on just kind of a low setting. And when I'm putting these on, it is crisscross applesauce right from the get-go. Okay. That's about it for that. We'll go ahead and get it on the ground and torque everything up proper. Bonus footage! I've got the On the Rocks tie rod replacement. Premium tie rod replacement upgrade. We're going to throw that on, see what it looks like. It's mine, it's about 2 rocks away from snapping off on the one side. Let's get to it. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the two. The On the Rocks one's very high speed, low drag. Very high quality. We got greasable ends. That'll help with the life. It just needs a bit of adjustment that I'll do here on the ground to get it real close. And then we'll pop it in the vehicle and see if we can get it aligned. Now what I did was, off camera, I measured the distance from the center of the steering arm joint to the center of the right tie rod joint. And I also measured the center of the right tie rod joint to the center of the left tie rod joint. And I wrote the numbers down right there. So we're just gonna get it real close from here.
Another one.
That's it. All we gotta do now is put it down, final torque, we're out the door.